Andy, Ousmane Dembele, perhaps unsurprisingly, showed up at the Ballon d'Or because he was injured. He had a reason. But the rest of his teammates, where were they and why weren't they there?
Yeah, that shouldn't really be a qualifier, should it? He turned up to the ceremony because he was injured. Because, of course, PSG had a game on the same night at the other end of the country, Ballon d'Or ceremony in Paris, of course. And it was meant to be, really, the coronation of PSG. Whether you think that's the coronation of this particular team or the QSI project or whatever, that's something we can discuss in a minute. But of course, they were scheduled to be playing the biggest game in French football, Le Classique, on Sunday night against Marseille, at Marseille. And it was called off because of storms. Now, by the French League rule book, if it's called off by extreme weather, it happens the following day, presuming the pitch is playable. The pitch looked perfect. Now, clearly, because this was not just a platform for PSG in front of the world or Ousmane Dembele, it was a platform for French football. The LFP, the league, would have far preferred if it had been put to another day. So, say, the Tuesday, or there was a midweek in December where it could have happened. And Marseille were like, well, no. No, because we're the home team. We want it to suit us. If you look at the rule book, it's meant to be played on the following day. So we insist it is played on the following day. Now, of course, there's part of this is the fact that PSG have got a degree of injuries at the moment. It wasn't just Ousmane Dembele who was at the ceremony because he was injured and not with the team, but also Désiré Doué, who's the best player in the Champions League final. And look, I think a part of it is Marseille wanted to play it as soon as possible due to the injuries that PSG have. But also, I think a little bit of it was they kind of wanted to ruin PSG's night as well. And do you know what? I think a club has to do right by its fans, and that's what most Marseille fans would have wanted. Now, look, I'm not saying that PSG didn't want to be there, because, of course, a lot of those players who were, mentioned in the upper echelons of the rankings, so you're looking at Vitinha, Achraf Hakimi, Kvisha Kvaratskhelia, were all there playing when they presumably rather would have been in Paris. I don't think that had any effect on the kind of cold night they had. No, because I just think that Marseille were really ready for it. Really, really ready for it. And they're a different proposition at home. The atmosphere was huge because, a lot of those people have been waiting for an extra day. Marseille scored early and they deserved to win. And it reminded me a little bit of the Botafogo game in the Club World Cup, where you could see PSG with a better team, but it didn't feel like an impossible pressure and that they were definitely going to score at some point. And Marseille, I thought, dealt with it really well. Obviously, to an extent, Roberto De Zerbi got well overexcited, got red carded near the end, went mad like they won the World Cup at the end of it. Again, all the stuff that the fans would want. Bear in mind that they hadn't beaten PSG at home in a league game since 2011, which is pretty much the whole length of the QSI period in charge. But I guess it did leave a strange little cloud over what happened further north in Paris that evening.
But it was the right decision, wasn't it, Miguel? They got a result. They beat PSG, and that's hard enough to do nowadays.
From Marseille's perspective, absolutely. And I mean, there's already been a few murmurs coming out about how much De Zerbi would have used all this to fuel his team. A figure like this, I mean, they'd rather be at their party and this sort of thing. And he's absolutely justified in doing it. It is a little bit of a kind of, it's a game and an event rich with narrative and so many little things coming together. One of them almost being also the place of, French football and modern football, this kind of glamorous, glitzy individual award ceremony was detracting attention from an actual football match, but that still managed to, and obviously given the issues the French league has had recently, but the football match still managed to disrupt the storyline, shall we say, or disrupt the ending.
It was brilliant the way that Pablo Longoria...
Football finds a way, maybe.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Well, it's funny, really. We talked about it before, the fact that all through the QSI years, PSG have done so many different things to try and get the world to look at football from their perspective. So whether it's, inviting Jay-Z and Leonardo DiCaprio to the Parc des Princes, whether it's getting Zlatan, whether it's getting Neymar, whether it's the deal with Jordan, all these things. And remarkably, the point at which they get the world on side is just by having a great football team.
Yeah.
Who'd have thought football sells football? It's remarkable, isn't it? It shouldn't be remarkable, but it kind of is remarkable in the modern era. And it kind of made me laugh when Pablo Longoria, the president of Marseille, said before, he said, and obviously he's laying it on quite thick, and he said, well, obviously it's a shame for PSG, but, football is about playing football matches, isn't it? And I thought, you've got an enormous cheek saying that. You're right, but you've got an enormous cheek saying that.
Are we focusing, though, on the wrong thing, Miguel? Because the Ballon d'Or is an individual award. Ousmane Dembele won the award, and yet it has so much symbolism that actually this is about PSG and the QSI project. Well, is it?
You can't take away what it means to an individual player. That is, and it's interesting. We can get into what the Ballon d'Or has become as well. Growing up in the early 90s or mid 90s, there used to be this kind of old world gravitas and prestige to it. And you'd associate with photos of Cruyff or George Best holding up what was actually a much more humble orb. And I think it's sort of stayed this way into the 2000s. It's been interesting, Michael Owen and Rio Ferdinand talking about this, how it didn't mean the same thing. I actually felt it meant something more when Owen won it, because it had that sort of, this dignity to it. Whereas now I think it's become this great award has become quite an undignified process. The talk at the moment has been how the lobbying is more aggressive than ever, and exactly what you say there about the kind of what it means to QSI, Qatar, and the PSG project. It's exact. This is just more kind of legitimacy. Essentially, it's the more of this sort of thing you accumulate, the more it legitimizes what is a political project using football as a vehicle.
Are we disrespecting Ousmane Dembele then, Andy, for all the efforts that he contributed at the end of the day to PSG winning the Champions League last season? He had a remarkable season, he injured some of the time, etc. And we're talking about his award as a communal. It's always a communal effort. I get that point, but not about the club. It's not about the club. It's about the players.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting from a football perspective. I think Miguel and I differ slightly on this, because I feel quite strongly that he deserved it, and particularly as a symbol for something that football-wise was more of a collective triumph, or as much of a collective triumph as any team since probably Bayern in 2013, if we're talking about the Champions League and if we're talking about a treble winner. And the fact that, and I guess this is from the players' perspective, why they would have been annoyed to miss it, is because it was a celebration of that collective effort. Because Ousmane Dembele, for me, deserved to win it, but you could have made cases for Hakimi, you could have made cases for Vitinha, you could have made cases for Kvaratskhelia, for Gigi Donnarumma. There's a number of them, and I think he's just the one that's been chosen to.
But is that not contrary to the concept of the entire award? It is an individual award.
Yeah, that's right. And I would say if you're going to pick out an individual from the best team in Europe, it has to be Dembele.
Then that makes it just an element of default. Well, we have to give it to someone who's won the Champions League. That's sort of what it's become. We have to.
I know what you mean, but look, I still think football is about winning the big trophies, and I don't mean the Ballon d'Or. I mean the Champions League, and they did it in amazing style, and he had a huge effect on that. The point where he becomes centre forward, if we're just talking about the pure footballness of it, and maybe the Ballon d'Or should be something more. That's a discussion we can have for sure. But if we're talking about the sheer footballness of it, him becoming the centre forward makes PSG. It turns them from a team that's not very impressive in the first half of the Champions League season to when we start in 2025, they're absolutely flying. And a huge part of that is Dembele and how he changes his game. Now, I guess...
What else happened at the start of 2025?
Go on.
They signed Kvaratskhelia.
Yeah, sure.
It's true. It's such nonsense, I think. Sorry. If the whole point of the award, and one of the things even as I kind of complain about what it's become, I actually think that it is still correct that some players will be better than others. It's actually right that this is recognised. Again, I think it's part of quite a rich lineage in the game, especially when you look at the names on that list. And we are recognising greatness here. That's to be the point. And this is why, I'm not saying he doesn't have an argument. It just feels so thin. I mean, to be honest, people will complain about this, but given Paris Saint-Germain's obscene advantage over all of France, you can basically write off all contributions, and that shouldn't come into it. And I don't.
So
think
we're not talking about the treble, just the Champions League.
I think it should be just Champions League, really.
I mean, I guess you could say that about. It's funny how the sort of duopoly of the Ballon d'Or for so many years is kind of between Ronaldo and Messi. It's kind of reflective of what's happened to Europe's major leagues, really, isn't it?
It's particularly pronounced in France, more than anywhere, especially at that level, at Ballon d'Or level. Like, it's not like we're talking about, say, Sconto Riga in the 90s, who had a similar, dominance of the Latvia League. This is considered a Champions League level. So then it does sort of come down to the Champions League, because PSG will just win the league by default, and they usually do it by 90 points. That's what they accumulate around that level. And then it sort of comes down to, well, 4 goals, 2 of them against Brest, who they hammer anyway, and 1 against Liverpool, fair enough, that was a decisive goal, and 1 against Arsenal. And it does feel a little bit thin when you're comparing it, when you look at what's actually on that list. And also, if it is about individual performances, let's be fair, Dembele didn't there's a difference between doing a good tactical job and say what Yamal did at Inter. And I know I'm picking out one game, but
I guess this
think
is
the latter is what the award is about.
Always the big awards come down, just like the big trophies, come down to a couple of games, don't they? I mean, you could say that if we're talking about non-Messi, Ronaldo Ballon d'Or winners, you're talking about Cannavaro winning it in 2006 off the back of an incredible World Cup, and he was really dreadful when he turned up at Real Madrid the following season. We're talking about Luka Modric in 2018, where Modric had lots of better years of his career. Yeah. Most of them, actually many of them, following that as he got older. He got better and better for Real Madrid off the back of that 2018 win. But the fact is, I guess that's a question. In terms of what means the most in football, is it making it happen in those biggest games? And maybe what it means outside football, does it mean something to the people who don't watch football every single week? And we're not giving him a mark every single week that tots up to something.
There are so many caveats when it comes to this. On the one hand, yeah, you're right. It's like the Oscars, isn't it? It's that person may have acted very well in the movie, but all the others contributed to it as well. And there's always a question
mark. Back onto Diamonds Are Forever.
No, I'm not this time. On this one occasion, I'm going to leave my starring role, minor starring role in Diamonds Are Forever out of it.
Connery couldn't have done it without you.
Well, I saw his seat. He did it without me, and then he left to go off to Spain, but his seat was there. It had Sean Connery at the back of it. Pinewood Studios, 1972. That's another story and a different world. But honestly, on a serious note, of course, there are so many issues around an award like this, not least that it's more likely to be a striker that gets the award because, let's face it, goals make the difference.
And because of the Messi Ronaldo years, perhaps?
That's something I actually don't necessarily have an issue with. And I say this as someone who played left back for a large portion of when I actually played football.
You're never going to win it as left back.
But attackers are attackers because they're more talented. And it's about creation rather than destruction.
It's like the lead guitarist, but Paul McCartney ended up being arguably the one with the greater musical legacy in the Beatles, etc.
We can all point to Barezi's and Maldinis, but where does the best player play? They always eventually evolve to number 10.
Do you agree with that? Should it be an award for the striker, essentially?
Well, I think if we're talking about what it means outside football, and funnily enough, that was something that I've never really been that bothered about the Ballon d'Or. And I've, like Miguel, find it all a little bit unseemly, especially the really aggressive lobbying for players to win it. And actually, Franck Ribéry was one of those, and it didn't quite work out for him because, of whatever happened in 2013, because there was some levels on that. But I think I found it quite upsetting when Vinícius didn't win it, actually. Now, I felt less upset about it afterwards when Real Madrid whined and complained about it for absolutely ages. And, maybe we'll come on to Vini later.
We will.
But for me, what Vinícius represented off the pitch really mattered. Like, that he did it. He did all those great things and he won the Champions League despite everything he had to deal with, and some of the treatment he had to deal with from the stands in Spain. And for me, that felt that was something that was symbolic and that was more.
I think that's problematic. With all due respect, Andy, I know where you're coming from with this, but I think then you end up sort of saying, is it because he is black? And to a certain extent, you're bringing that in. It's a burden that black footballers have to take.
Yes.
No, I don't think they should have a special treatment. But arguably, Vini was the best player the year before, wasn't he?
Yeah, I do think that's an element to it. I think what you represent, as much of, did you score goals in these big games? I think that should count. I think it should mean something more. That's my view. And I think if you're making the case for all those years that Messi and Ronaldo won it, I think you can say in a different way, in a very different way, of course, they meant something more. They transcended football. So I think that's an important thing. But I guess like the fact is, Miguel, you can't say that the Ballon d'Or is the same post Messi and Ronaldo than it was before.
No, absolutely. They've turned it into something else. And also I think because of how much is attached to kind of the commercial era. This is actually, it's a book there's a book that touches on this very well, which is Josh Robinson's and Jonathan Clegg's on basically, it's about the Messi-Ronaldo duel, but it's not so much about the duel itself, it's also about this, mega industry they created. And it's an industry that it was already going this way, but they turbocharged it in the sense of how much football is about how much is commercially loaded on the individual and stars rather than actually what it is with a team game. And of course, this has created this monster in the sense that you now actually have players talking about how they want to win the Ballon d'Or before they mention the Champions League or the World Cup.
So it's kind of like winning the Brits in terms of the boost of sales that might mean.
There's an element of it, yeah. This is kind of, and the accoutrement to your career.
And he's already mentioned Vini Jr. And he's probably sitting there thinking, oh yeah, you're spending all this time talking about Ousmane Dembele. You didn't talk about me not winning it last time and Rodri got it instead of me, etc.
Well, on that, actually, I've got a lot of blowback because I wrote on Monday that Yamal should have won it. And I suppose I discussed what we're talking about now. And one of the most responses I got was, why aren't you advocating for Mohamed Salah? Now, my response to that would be, I rarely think a domestic league is enough, and they probably went out of Europe too early.
Yeah, I see that.
Let's talk about Vini Jr. now. There seems to be slightly conflicting thoughts about his position at Real Madrid at the moment, whether he's enjoying the experience or not enjoying the experience, whether they're enjoying the experience, not whether Xabi Alonso and him are getting on or not. And yet, when you look on the pitch, when he had the recent match against Levante, he scores and puts a smile on Xabi Alonso's face, and it seems like there is no problem. Is there an issue? What's going on there?
I think we're examining what's on Xabi Alonso's face at that moment. That is part of the problem, I think. And it's funny because if you go back a couple of days before that, when Real Madrid beat Espanyol, and Vini gets taken off in that, he makes it clear that he's very unhappy about that. And of course, all this speculation starts blowing up again about his future. Now, what happens against Levante this midweek, where, again, Real Madrid win 4-1, no problem with the result, 7 out of 7, brilliant start for Xabi Alonso. And Vinícius opens the scoring and he ends the game wearing the captain's armband, which feels quite symbolic. Obviously, it's symbolic of who's unavailable and not on the pitch at that time to a certain extent, but as well, it kind of marks him out as a team leader. Now, look, a lot has changed over the last year since that 2024 final at Wembley, in which he scored the goal that clinched it, and everyone thought it'd be his route to the Ballon d'Or, although that's not necessarily the most important thing. It is a factor in this, I feel. That he wasn't amazing last season. Now, numbers-wise, he wasn't terrible either. He was good. He was still really good. But it's kind of like Kylian Mbappé scoring 37 goals in his first season for Real Madrid. Because of the moments where it didn't go well and because they didn't end up winning everything, everyone's a lot more under the microscope. And I think it's quite indicative of where Vini Jr. is at Real Madrid at the moment, in that you have a torrent of, well, maybe Real Madrid are going to get rid of him in the very near future in Spain after that Espanyol game. You know, they were talking about maybe a lot of Spanish periodicals and newspapers talking about, well, maybe they'll get rid of him at the next transfer window, even, which you think, whoa, that seems a bit drastic. And then 4 days later, he's wearing the captain's armband. Now, the fact that the win seems so changeable around Vini Jr. tells you that the problem. I still think the major problem is the contract one. The fact that he is into the last 2 years of his contract, and the two sides seem quite a long way apart on a resolution.
On what issues?
So at the moment, they were discussing the contract for a year. At the moment, there are no discussions, which is indicative in itself. And I suppose it's about. So I mean, what I've been told before I came on this podcast, actually, from what I understand, Vini is obviously assessing the situation, and he won't want to be a rotational player, as they put it. And this is, I mean, it's a really interesting thing in terms of
the Xavi model, isn't it? The Xavi Alonso model is we rotate. We've got a big squad.
And the other side of that as well is, of course, that, and I think it's a really interesting juncture in terms of both Madrid and also what we're talking about in terms of like this rise of individuals related to the Ballon d'Or that obviously Vini so wanted, in that for decades, really going back to the kind of foundation of the modern Madrid in the 1950s, this has been a club entirely shaped by stars. And it's why basically they've resisted ideology coaches, because ideology coaches, you know, impose a system over stars. Whereas like Ancelotti, it's why he was for so long the perfect coach for the club, because he just found a way to accommodate all of this. And now,
it's like a more glamorous Vicente Del Bosco, basically, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And now this is the first time they've hired an ideology manager. And so what happens? He immediately obviously starts, you know, going for the system over the players. And there's a really interesting one there, of course, because Alonso played under Jose Mourinho at Real Madrid. What was Mourinho famous for? Well, immediately coming in and often dropping a big player. Just almost, well, I think in Mourinho's case it was as much about the psychology of the group rather than the tactics, because he wasn't the kind of he wasn't a systems manager in the same way that modern coaches are. I think this is purely tactical. But from what I'm told as well, there is another element, which is Alonso, even though he obviously is an urbane, you know, measured fella that everyone loves and admires, really, there's naturally an ego there. And an ego also is he wants to create his own. He doesn't want to come in and basically just take what Madrid is there and keep on doing it. He wants to fashion his own thing. And the perception I've got from inside Madrid is that this is why he's promoting some of the younger players, especially like Güler, because there's more of a sense, right, these weren't getting used before, this is now my side. And he's kind of, everyone else, I suppose, has to adapt around that. But then, of course, there is the other side to this, which is the biggest star of all, in that, I mean, to some degree, it's an issue that hasn't gone away for Vini, which is Mbappé. I mean, he was signed as a number 9, but he's not a number 9. He's closer to what Vini is.
But I guess that's it. It's always been cast as it's a positional issue between Mbappé and Vinícius Jr. It doesn't necessarily need to be. But it is a question of state.
It is positional in which sense as well?
Exactly. That's it. I think it's a question of status and egos, because it's his team, and I think before Mbappé comes, it's his team, the biggest club in the world, and he is the best player, maybe the best player in the world. And so I guess a couple of things happen that really put his nose out of joint. Now, he doesn't win the Ballon d'Or, which is a massive deal to him, and a massive deal to him that, you know, given that Real Madrid have got history of handling superstars very well, I don't think they handled this very well, and I think they kind of fueled his sense of injustice to his detriment, actually. And I think that's an issue
with their protests.
Yes, but the arrival of Mbappé is another thing, because I think from the outside, if you're Vini, and this is partly the positional thing, you'd be thinking, hang on, why do we need this bloke?
Yeah. So
and then it automatically, a little bit like Mbappé arriving at PSG, kind of nudges it away from Neymar goes to PSG because he thinks that's going to be my team. And like a very short time afterwards, he's stood there with his hands in his pockets while Kylian Mbappé is showing off the World Cup. And that is a massive problem for him.
So on that, Perez, he is actually a great fan of Vini. He loves him. And this is one of the reasons why they lobbied so hard, basically, to placate him, really. Just like, look,
Perez, as in the president.
Yeah, Florentino, look how much we love you. But then at the same time, and like this comes down to, again, this constant tension within Madrid. I remember being told, I wrote this in the time, I think I've said it on the podcast, the night before the Champions League final in 24 in Wembley, I was talking to people from Madrid, and they were going on at length about how they're here again because They took these big decisions around 2019, 2020 through COVID to get away from the old model, start signing the best young players. Because I think half of the team that started the 24 final were signed as teenagers or under the age of 21.
And they shed a lot of big contracts in the years before that, don't they? Yeah.
And also, like, it had been really carefully constructed. This is mostly kind of masterminded by Juni Califat, the director of recruitment, who really has a more powerful role than that title suggests. And like every single, like, so Bellingham was signed really as a long-term successor to Modric. Then they obviously wanted a long-term successor to Benzema. Now, problem became actually that Bellingham sort of became the successor to Benzema rather than Modric. And now they need him to be Modric again. But I remember being told that we've got the system as we want it. What you actually need is a link between the wide players, Vini and Rodrigo. But they signed Mbappé, who can fulfill that role. Doesn't really fit into what they had. And the line was basically... what the president wants, the president gets. And in Perez's head, he would just see it as, from what we know, from like the 20 years of, or 25 years of behaviour, he would just say, well, there's two stars, make them play together.
Yeah.
Although, if they can't play together, there is one huge problem. Uneasy sleeps the head that wears a crown, of course. If you're the top dog, where do you go after Real Madrid? What are the options for Vini Jr?
I think that is a really great question, because where they are at the moment, I think most other clubs, if you've got a player of that quality, that value, that status at this stage in his contract, you're panicking now. You're panicking hard, because he's going to end up with maximum 18 months left on his contract when you're in a position to sell him, which massively affects his value. Now, if we look at Real Madrid past, they've always been happier than most clubs to let star players' contracts run down if they haven't found the right deal with them. Because Real Madrid can rightfully say, well, where are you going to go? That's not here. Where are you going to go that's better than here? And they already know with Vinícius Jr, Saudi have been banging down his door for ages now. And his plan, it seems, at the start of the contract negotiations was to use Saudi as the bogeyman, which I think is smart, to say, do you know how much they can offer me? Now, obviously, though, your response to that, if you're Real Madrid, is a little bit like PSG. We're not paying the wages that we did, say, 5 years ago. We're not doing that. Remember, Kylian Mbappé took a significant pay cut to come and join Real Madrid. And we're not even trying to align ourselves with Manchester City or PSG when it comes to those sort of wages. And the other thing is, like, well, you just go, if it is about the money, we're never going to match that in a million years. So go on, off you go then. Because really, there's nothing they can say to that. But the fact that he hasn't...
After you go to Saudi Arabia.
Yes, but the fact that Vinícius Jr hasn't taken that, despite the fact they would offer him the golden bridge, as they say in France, they would offer him anything and everything he wants. He hasn't taken it. Well, what does that tell you? It tells you that he doesn't really want to go. So he's kind of shown his hand, really. And I think when you look at how relatively few places there are that he could end up,
so
in Europe,
what I would say, 4 or 5 clubs. That's 4 or 5 clubs.
If that.
Yeah.
If that.
And it's such a sadness, that as well. I mean, I know we're going to go down to it in the Europa League section, but like, how stratified European football. 20 years ago, there's a good 15 clubs that Vini could realistically, or a player of his level could have gone to. I mean, I could bring up the example of Valencia was like an option for.
Yeah.
Now, look, there's obviously bigger discussions you could have there about like their own kind of decisions over those years and you know what happened at a club like that. But it's just it's so grim. I find that it's just so narrow at the top level.
Miguel, it feels like you've done this before, because every time I'm thinking, let's move on to the next subject, Miguel tees it up, puts it on the penalty spot for me to bang in. The state of the Europa League, I think, is worth considering. We're recording now on Thursday. Thursday, normally the day or the night when we'll be experiencing Europa League football. That's what we know it for. It kicked off yesterday, though, Andy, on Wednesday, with a flurry of matches. I wonder whether there is an existential problem with the Europa League, which is it's not the Champions League, and why would you follow it if your team wasn't in it?
Yeah, and I think that's something that people have thought about the Europa League ever since it morphed from the UEFA Cup. But I think that had changed a lot in recent years, mainly due to the fact that there were really great games at the back end of it. We had some good finals. Now, last year was the absolute opposite of that. Now, of course, we tend to sometimes remember the final and say that reflects the rest of the competition, which is not always true. You know, there were so many European club finals that are completely non-reflective of the tournament that went before. The one I always think of is the 1999 Champions League final, in which Manchester United are indisputably the best team in that year's Champions League. They don't play well in the final, but they just about managed it to get over the line. So they don't deserve to win the final, but they deserve to win the competition, if you see what I mean.
I do.
But people don't really tend to remember that sort of detail. And I think when people think of the 2025 Europa League, they will remember two absolutely huge clubs in Tottenham and Manchester United who delivered a really awful football spectacle. And I'm sure Tottenham have no problem with that at all, and they shouldn't have, because they got there and they won it and they got in the Champions League, and that's great. But I actually think that was quite reflective of the competition as a whole. Now, look, the group stages of the Europa League, I don't think anyone's been gripped by those for a number of years, because clearly there has been, I think, a bigger gap between the haves and the have-nots in the Europa League than there is in the Champions League, and that has been a problem on a group stage level. But when we've had this change to the new format of the Champions League and of the Europa League, one of the major effects, and the side effects that you don't think of when there's a reformatting, is the fact, as we've said before on here, that you don't get the teams who finish third in the Champions League group dropping down to the Europa League, because it's a league format now, and because you don't have that cross-pollination between the competitions. Now, obviously, a lot of people for a great many years thought this was really unfair. It was a reward for losers, that you get to drop out of the Champions League, which you weren't good enough to stay in, and just go into another competition. But I think we saw last season what an effect some of those teams had in not necessarily winning it in all cases, but, you know, creating great ties, and you getting to the back end of the Europa League and thinking, oh, you know, it could be an Arsenal-Napoli, for example, and you think, oh yeah, this is great European football, and that got people excited about the Europa League, where there was nothing to do that last season. So if you think the most memorable match of the knockouts in the Europa League last season was Manchester United versus Lyon, the 5-4. Now, look, I went to that. I'll never forget it. It was brilliantly exciting, but let's not pretend it was anything other than a festival of incompetence. It wasn't top-level European football. There is no question that it was top-level European football. Now, obviously, part of that is the current state of Manchester United, that Lyon were walking out of there having played all of extra time and the back end of normal time with 10 men. And they're thinking, how did we lose that? You know, at Manchester United, and you know, obviously that's indicative of where they are at this present time. But I think the fact that the best game and the most memorable game of the knockouts was essentially the football equivalent of someone falling down the stairs and landing on their face, that shouldn't be the pinnacle of a competition like that.
Miguel, what does the Europa League then have to do to get, you know, objective? Not objectives, not the right, but impartial viewers to watch it and to follow it entire season?
Well, in reality, you probably need football's version of Das Kapital, because as ever, this comes down to distribution of wealth in football.
In the original German.
Well, yeah. But so, money is so central to this, and also not just for all the usual reasons that I talk about in the pod, but also because European club competition has been such an engine for this problem, especially the Champions League, where it's created these vast disparities, it's created these one-team leagues across Europe. But in this situation, say, I didn't like, as a principle, the idea of clubs dropping down from the Champions League into the Europa League. But what it did was solve a problem, and we're seeing that problem now even to greater extremes, where from the original qualifiers, because some of them are going to be from the top leagues, they're going to have much greater budgets than most of the competition.
Like, it is mad, really, if you think about, obviously, Forest started last night at Real Betis. One of the first things that Betis did when Forest came out to train is they said, it's an honour to have a 2-time European champion here. You think, oh yeah, they are, aren't they?
Yeah. And they've got the stars on the shirt, I noticed that.
But realistically, they're also a team that hasn't been in Europe for 30 years.
Yeah.
And at the same time, they're probably the favourites for the competition.
Yeah. The point I was going to make was that clubs dropping down served as a bridge between, it made the competition more staggered. There wasn't such a gap between most of the field and the wealthy clubs. And the irony, of course, is that bridge is even needed more now than it was even a few years ago, because obviously the English League has just accelerated away for everything else. So if you look at the last kind of Deloitte money rankings, out of the top 20, how many teams are in? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So 10 of the 21 wealthiest clubs in Europe are English. That means 3 of those clubs at least are going to be in the Europa League. And that means there is, by definition, every single season, there is going to be a massive, massive gap. And that is a problem that's very difficult for the competition to get around. And it's why, that United Spurs game was so symbolic in so many ways, right? I mean, and the incompetence of, some of the process there, the progress, particularly on the United side, I suppose, was almost this manifestation of how these teams can so underperform. They can so underperform the resources, but those resources will just get them through. And that is quite sad, especially what European football is supposed to be about. But also, there's an additional issue, I think, as well, which is the Europa League has sort of been cannibalized from both ends now, in that clubs that would have looked to win it are now obviously offered more games in the Champions League. And it's why a club like Celtic would be so irritated to miss out on that this year. Although, I was about to say they have a reasonable chance of winning it. They don't really, the Europa League.
Them and Rangers are kind of in this midway point, aren't they?
Yeah.
Where they're probably not going to win the Europa League, but they're missing out on the Champions League money as well.
Exactly, yeah. But then on the other side, the Europa Conference, which has actually become this kind of quite vibrant competition because it gives clubs opportunity. That's taken something else away from the Europa League. Although I'm still of the principle that the Europa Conference shouldn't have anyone from the top 5 leagues.
There will be a point where during the season, there is a point, isn't there, where we will be watching it because it's either getting exciting or because there's a lot of jeopardy now. The closer you get to the final, there will be a point where people tune in, whether their team's in it or not.
Yeah, I don't know if you do get that point with the Europa League. I'm interested to know, outside of this room and the people who habitually join us, how many, and our listeners, how many people really were into the back end of the Europa League last season, even before you got to those quite underwhelming knockout games. You have teams who are contenders who never should have been, really. Teams and clubs that were dysfunctional. Lyon being quite a good example of that. Obviously, something we've talked about at length. But they're still sitting there 5 months on going, that was our chance. We could have won that. And realistically, with the way the season went, they shouldn't have been in a position to win that, but nevertheless were. And to me, this creates an issue because it's not necessarily a question that I'm asking on behalf of myself, but do we quickly reach a point where people are going, what is the actual point of the Europa League? And going to your point, I guess again,
the Cup Winners' Cup problem, basically.
Yeah, exactly. And when we're talking about sporting versus commercial, which is always that tricky balancing act that the UEFA has to negotiate as governing body and competition organizer, the Conference League, in principle, I would have been totally all over keeping third place teams from the groups out of the Europa League. In principle, I'm on board with your idea of not including teams in the top 5 leagues in the Conference League. If you're sitting in the UEFA offices, you're going to be asking, who's watching that? Aren't you?
But the one thing I've had this debate with a few people in European football, and I think it was suggested. I'm not speaking. I'm surmising here. It's possibly not true, but as far as I'm aware, I think the Europa Conference League is loss making. And if it's loss making as a principle, then forget about all that. It should just be a development. And also, surely, if the Champions League is going to be...
It's a loss leader to encourage competition.
Exactly, yeah. If the Champions League is going to be the monster it is, then the Champions League should actually be supporting the rest of the game in this way. UEFA shouldn't be considering something like... And we get into the bigger issues about kind of UEFA governance and all this sort of stuff, or governance in football, about how much should be dictated by the commercial motivations and how much should actually be driven by the regulation of the sport. But yeah, I mean, does it matter who watches the Europa Conference? This should be for these clubs. The entire reason it exists is for clubs that wouldn't usually get the opportunity for a European campaign to have one and to spread the wealth.
It's turned into something that no one expected it to turn into very, very quickly, hasn't it?
Yeah.
So the question is, are you watching? Are you watching? Are you watching the Europa League? Are you watching the Europa League?